Why hello there! Welcome back to Hello Vintage! A lot of people ask the same questions all the time, so here is a very concise, easy video to answer all of the frequently asked burning questions. Part of the fun of the job is answering questions, interacting with people, and I love spreading the wealth of knowledge. I would like to thank our lovely customers and people of the internet for submitting a fabulous list of questions. So here is a list of frequently asked questions for a vintage clothing store owner. Let's go! So the first question is, what is your favorite piece that you've ever sold? It's actually a really tough question, so it's between two of them. So the first one is a 1950s wedding gown that went to this woman who went upstairs, was like, oh, do you have any bridal? And I was like, yeah, we have a few. And she brought down one and she was like, wow, this is the prettiest dress I've ever seen. I would love it if this fits, but like fingers crossed, because you know, sometimes with vintage it's hard to fit. She put it on. It was amazing. She brought a veil that was her great-grandmother's veil. She put it on, matched perfectly, and that was it. That was her dress. She said yes to the dress. She walked out. She looked amazing. I'm going to insert a photo. It was amazing. It was just a match made in heaven, and that was a favorite piece, not just because the gown was gorgeous and I almost used it as my own wedding dress, but also because it was just one of those moments of why I do this job, where things are just so gratifying and finding the perfect owner for every piece is the best part. My second favorite piece that I've ever sold was this gorgeous 1890s printed cotton dress. If you've seen the previous videos, you know I have a thing for printed cotton antique dresses, and this one was no exception. I only let it go because I don't need to hoard them and because I want to share the love with everyone else. So the next question is, what is your favorite fashion era? Ooh, that's a hard one. I would say that I really love medieval fashion and like maybe a bit towards the Renaissance. The next question is, will capes come back in style? And the answer is they're already in style. This year I sold more capes than ever. People are very attracted to just the drama that capes bring. They're fun to wear. They make a fashion statement. They're cozy. It's like wearing a little blanket. If you're an introvert, you can just like hide inside your cape. And yeah, they're back. Are there any pieces you regret selling? My two biggest regrets of selling were both gunny sack dresses. One of them was because I didn't realize that gunny sack dresses were so collectible and special. So I sold it back in high school for like not that much. I think I sold it for like $20 or $40, and it's one of the super rare ones. It makes me cry every time I look at the picture of it, but not to be too over dramatic. I'm sure I made someone very, very happy with that. The second one is when I accidentally sold one of my own gunny sack dresses. It was when I had first opened the Hello Vintage store, and I had all of the gunny sack dresses on one giant rack, and I had a few of my own mixed in there because I had just been doing photo shoots with them, and someone came in and perused the rack and they were like, ooh, like I like this one, and I'm too awkward of a person to be like, oh, actually that's mine. And so I sold it to her, and then it took me a few years to find the same one in the same size, and then I had to pay a lot more for it than I actually even sold the one to her for. So those would be my regrets of selling. What got you interested in vintage? It's a very, very good question. So I first started getting interested in the older things when I used to go to antique stores, yard sales, thrift stores and stuff with my family. I wouldn't say that we were cheap, but we were cheap. So I personally was always looking for the oldest thing I could find. I wasn't super into clothes at the beginning because I was 7 years old. So it wasn't until I would say I was in high school that I really began appreciating vintage clothing specifically, and then beginning to specialize in that. Because before that, I didn't have a specialty. I just kind of like bought and sold whatever. I don't know why, it's like an addiction. Like, I have never not bought things to sell. Even like third grade, and I would host yard sales for my neighbors, and then they would basically just give me all of their stuff and be like, here, I was just gonna donate it, but you can take 50% of the profits if you want to sell it. So I would set up the whole thing, make all the posters. I don't know how this was allowed, because it was just me, like this like 9-year-old kid, like sitting on someone else's driveway, like selling all of their stuff. But whatever it was, it got me very, very interested in the business side of it. And I think that was a lot of practice and training for having a store and selling my own things. The next question is, how did you know you wanted to open a vintage clothing store? So that probably ties back to the second half of that question where I began selling clothing specifically in high school, I was selling online at the time. I was probably 15 or 16 at the time, and I wasn't old enough to have a real job. And I was like, okay, if I can't have a real job, then I'll just sell things online. So I began buying things specifically to sell on the internet. But the thing that was always missing was the human interaction, so I was trying to find that whenever I could. And I realized that if I wanted to do this and feel fulfilled by it, then I really should take it more seriously and actually do it and open up a store. What is your favorite piece currently in the store? One of my favorite pieces is the inauguration dress. That was a dress that was worn to John F. Kennedy's inaugural ball in 1961. It was a dress that was made in 1959. It's a stunner. It is a stunner. It is gorgeous. It's well known in the Hello Vintage world that it's one of my favorite dresses. I would say that, and then I have a kind of like a cranberry red pin-tucked Titanic era dress. They're gorgeous and they're pieces of history. The next question is, what are the best resources for getting into vintage and historical fashion? So this is a good question because I never actually had a formal fashion education. I'm very much self-taught. If you really want to dive in, just get one of those like big encyclopedias of fashion. One of the things that you'll learn very quickly when learning fashion history is that fashion is a response and not an island. That's something that Amanda from Ultimate Fashion History always says, is that fashion is always a response to the world around you. Example right now is the trend of cottagecore. It references like medieval periods, fairy tales, the prairie, Edwardian. It takes the different periods of history that are very, very much spread out. It doesn't reference just one part of history. But because we're in a time with like lockdowns and everything, people are using their imaginations more, and I think that era of the fantastical and things like that are much more common right now in using as kind of a mental escape through fashion. The same where in the 1940s, fabric was rationed because of wartime. So you'll be seeing silhouettes that use much less fabric, but they might have different decorations or they're tailored very well. Everything is a response to the times around it. I would also say if you want to get into vintage and historical fashion, get books, but also get linked up. Like go to a vintage store and chat with them about the clothes. Look up YouTube channels like Ultimate Fashion History is a really good one. Abby Cox's channel is good for historical garments, Bernadette Banner, Not Your Mama's History. There's so many different, just history and fashion history are so much mixed, so you can mix them all together. Definitely a lot of resources just on the YouTubes right here that you can use. Once you find your footing, then you'll kind of be able to find out where things are. And I know it's never fun advice with like, you'll figure it out, but I started with reading a book. My apologies, my camera decided to shut off. Reading a book just about the overview of vintage fashion kind of lets you know what areas you're not that well informed in, so then you can research those more, and then that will strengthen your overall fashion history knowledge. The next question is, what is the oldest garment in your collection? I think at the moment I have 2 garments from the 1700s. I have a bonnet veil from 1765 when machine-made lace was first invented, pretty much. It's a ridiculously rare piece. It's not currently for sale, honestly, because I have no way of valuing that. Like, it's so rare, I cannot find any comparable amount out there. So that is the oldest piece. And then we also have a men's waistcoat from probably the 1790s, I would say. It's like the late 1700s. Those are the 2 oldest pieces right now. What's the tea right now in the vintage community? Oh goodness, okay. What is the tea? I don't even remember writing down this question, so this caught me off guard. I would say that a lot of the tea right now is mirrored off of what's going on in society. So a lot of the questions that are being raised right now are, how can you fit historical costuming into history in a way that doesn't glorify the bad parts of the past? So I guess an example would be cotton. I said I really enjoy like the printed cotton antique dresses. but that cotton came from somewhere if you're getting your dress from a certain time period. So if you have a cotton dress from when slavery was legal, then it's probably a cotton dress made using slave labor. So at what point, like, how do we justify appreciating these garments knowing that they came from enslaved individuals? And that's something that I think we're all, as a vintage community, are grappling with right now. Is there's no answer to that. Like, do we burn all of these pieces? Do we preserve them? How do we preserve them without glorifying the awful reasons why they were able to come into existence? And then at what point do you draw the line of what was acceptable and what wasn't? Like, when people were importing paisley from India and Scotland, is that okay? Like, what's okay? So I guess that's some of the tea. I would say some more tea is people creating reproductions and passing them off as originals. That's always something that's really difficult, especially for people who are new and don't necessarily know the difference. Label swapping can always be a thing. Not every community is perfect, and no way saying that the vintage community is perfect whatsoever. Yeah, that's definitely there's things that need to be addressed, like with everything. So I think I'll do a different video if you're interested in, I guess, the harder side, the difficult side, the less pretty side of vintage. And I'll leave it at that for this, because I'm definitely not getting into individual tea, because I know a lot. I love learning about drama, but I do not tell. I keep my secrets. What's your opinion on altering vintage clothing? Ooh, this is a hot topic. I think altering vintage clothing is fine. Different people have different opinions on this, obviously. I would say that there's certain things that you probably... Here's a Jonathan Van Ness quote. Just because you American doesn't mean you Amera should. There's some things that you probably shouldn't alter, like things that are one-of-a-kind designer pieces that probably belong in a museum as is. I don't know. It's like, how do you... Like, things were altered in the past. So another example is... There's a lot of dresses from the late Victorian era that were refashioned from previous Victorian garments that were refashioned from previous Victorian garments. So it's not uncommon to see fabric from an 1830s dress refashioned into an 1860s dress refashioned into an 1890s dress. Like, I have a beautiful 1870s dress that the skirt was refashioned in the 1890s to fit the silhouette of the time. So it was done all the time. The easiest part to answer is if there's something from probably, especially like the past 50 years, that you can alter and it'll make it fit you and you'll wear it and love it forever, then by all means do it. Like, that I think is worth it. Clothes are meant to be worn. If you own that piece, it's yours and you can do what you want with it. That's the moral of the story. And then the last question is, how do you find vintage stores when you travel? So this is a fun one, because this is something I do all the time. Do a quick Google search or a quick Yelp search and look for the most established vintage store in that area, because they will know all of their competition. They'll know everyone who came after them. They'll know everyone who came before them. They'll know all the independent sellers. Like, they'll know their market very, very well. So if you go there first, just ask them, like, any other places I should check out, and then they'll just give you the lowdown. So I very frequently take a list just like this. If someone's from out of town, I give them a full list of all the shops around to let them know, like, when the pop-up markets are and see if any of those coincide with when they're visiting. We are very open to spreading vintage. It's not a very cutthroat industry since everything's one of a kind. I would say sourcing vintage is a lot more cutthroat than selling vintage. So I hope these answer your questions. Please let me know if you have any more. This was very, very fun. I love answering questions, and I am excited to see you next time. So bye!